When he walked into his office that Monday morning, he learned that the risk management department he had built over 22 years was being shut down. Unnecessary cost, they said. Richard, we're going to handle this function through outsourcing now. He quietly nodded his head and said, "Understood." They had no idea that the company's $340 million insurance portfolio was entirely tied to his personal signature. For those working in risk management, have you ever been told your position was unnecessary? Share your experiences in the comments. Sometimes the most critical work remains invisible. Richard Coleman was 52 years old, and this was the story of how his 22-year career ended and how he quietly took his revenge. He had started at Summit Industries in 1999 as a young risk analyst. Back then, the company was a mid-sized manufacturing firm, and there was no such thing as a risk management department. Richard was someone working alone, trying to organize forgotten insurance policies and filing cabinets. But Richard wasn't just someone organizing files. As a mathematics graduate with an actuarial background, he could see, calculate, and model risks. In his first year, he had saved the company $2.3 million in unnecessary insurance premiums. In his second year, when a major production accident occurred, the company received $8.5 million in compensation because he managed the insurance coverage. By 2005, Richard was already responsible for an entire department on his own. Summit Industries' continued growth and never falling into any financial crisis was largely due to his foresight and planning, development of expertise. Richard's real strength was not just purchasing insurance policies, but turning them into strategic tools. He wrote every clause of every policy himself, determined every coverage himself. His negotiations with insurance companies had become legendary in the sector. When most companies went bankrupt during the 2008 financial crisis, Summit Industries remained standing. Thanks to the risks Richard had foreseen and insured against, the company not only survived the crisis, but also made a profit. In 2012, when there was a major cyber attack, most companies suffered millions of dollars in losses, but Summit Industries had no damage at all because Richard had arranged cybersecurity insurance in 2010. At that time, no one believed in such insurance. When the trade war began in 2018, many firms came to a standstill due to supply chain disruptions. Summit Industries continued without problems because Richard had arranged supply chain insurance. In every crisis, in every problem, Richard's signature was there, but no one saw this. In 2020, Summit Industries founder Harold Summit retired. His son Trevor Summit took his place. Trevor was 35 years old, an MBA graduate, someone who loved the words digital transformation and efficiency optimization. Trevor's first move was to modernize the company's old-fashioned departments. The human resources department was outsourced. Half of the accounting department was laid off. The IT department was moved to cloud-based systems. The risk management department was also on this modernization list. According to Trevor, insurance matters could now be handled with algorithms, automatic systems, artificial intelligence. People were unnecessary. The first sign came in early 2021. Trevor gave Richard a young assistant, Amanda Price, 26 years old, fresh MBA graduate. The purpose was to transfer Richard's knowledge to the system and modernize processes. Richard politely began teaching Amanda everything. But Amanda's real job wasn't to learn, it was to replace Richard. In mid-2021, Richard received the first serious signal. Trevor sent him a memo. Document risk management processes. Transfer all policy details to digital archive. Share your relationships with insurance companies with Amanda. Richard found this request strange. Why was he suddenly being asked to document work he'd been doing for 22 years? But it was Trevor's directive, and Richard complied. But Richard wasn't stupid either. While sharing all information, he kept critical details to himself. He gave policy clause numbers, but didn't fully explain the contents of the clauses. He shared insurance companies' names and contact information, but didn't record personal relationships and special agreements. Most importantly, he never mentioned the clauses that bore his signature. Have you ever faced such a situation? They try to extract your knowledge while preparing to replace you. Share your experiences in the comments. When Richard entered his office that Monday morning, he saw Trevor was there. A cardboard box was sitting on his desk. Trevor began speaking without looking up from his laptop computer. Trevor explained they were closing the risk management department and would handle this function through outsourcing, as it was more cost-effective. He acknowledged Richard's valuable contributions, but said the company was changing and needed modern solutions. Richard quietly began putting his personal belongings into the cardboard box. His 22-year diplomas and certificates, family photos, favorite coffee mug. Trevor mentioned the severance package was generous, 3 months' salary and health insurance plus a reference letter. Richard picked up the box, looked at Trevor, and said one word: understood. Trevor breathed a sigh of relief. There had been no fight. Richard's silence surprised him, but also relieved him. That evening, Richard sat at home, thinking about his 22-year career. He wasn't angry, he was disappointed. But he wasn't angry either. He was just prepared. Because there was something Trevor didn't know. Richard wasn't just an employee. He was also the architect of Summit Industries' insurance policies. And an architect's plans exist only with that architect. Richard opened his laptop and logged into his email account. There were 847 emails in his inbox. Most of these came from insurance companies. The professional network he had built over the years wasn't just a company email. Richard had a personal reputation. But what was really important was that Richard's personal signature was on all insurance policies. Tuesday morning, Richard made his first move. He reactivated his own insurance brokerage license. He had obtained this license in 1995, but wasn't using it because he worked at Summit. Now he could be an independent consultant. Wednesday, he made the second move. He sent a formal notification to all major insurance companies. Effective immediately, Richard Coleman is no longer authorized to represent Summit Industries in any insurance matters. Any existing policies bearing Richard Coleman's personal guarantee will require immediate review and reauthorization. This email was simple, professional, and appeared completely harmless. But it was actually a bomb. Thursday afternoon, the first call came. Amanda Price was calling, panicked. She said Global Insurance had called them, saying they wouldn't renew their general liability policy, and they didn't know how to make agreements without Richard. Richard calmly replied that he no longer worked at Summit, and this wasn't his problem. Friday, the second call came. This time it was Trevor himself. He said there seemed to be some misunderstanding. Insurance companies were calling Richard, not talking to them. Richard replied that he was now retired and wasn't dealing with Summit's insurance matters. When Trevor mentioned that Richard had given the information to Amanda, Richard explained he had given copies of policy information, but relationships couldn't be copied. Monday morning, the real truth emerged. Summit Industries' CFO urgently called Richard. He said there was a very serious problem. Insurance companies were declaring all their policies invalid, saying there was no coverage without Richard's personal guarantee. Richard acted surprised, asking what personal guarantee meant. The CFO didn't know and asked what was written in the policies Richard had signed. Richard paused, saying when Trevor fired him, he couldn't take copies of those policies, and suggested they check the digital archive. But the digital archive only had policy numbers. There was no content. Because Richard had never uploaded the full text of policies to the system, he had always kept them in his own files. Tuesday, Summit Industries' $340 million insurance coverage was officially canceled. The company became uninsured overnight. This meant production had to stop, no safety compliance. Customer orders had to be canceled, no product liability. Employees couldn't come to work, no workers' comp. Buildings had to be evacuated, no property insurance. Trevor went crazy. Amanda was helpless. The CFO was panicking. Wednesday, Trevor set aside his company pride and called Richard. He pleaded for Richard's help, offering to bring him back with double salary, whatever he wanted. Richard gave a clear answer. He was very happy in retirement, but could help as a consultant. When Trevor asked about consultant fees, Richard quoted a daily rate of $5,000 plus expenses, minimum 6-month contract. Trevor was silent. Daily $5,000 meant $100,000 per month, $600,000 in 6 months. When Trevor said this was too much, Richard pointed out that the company's daily revenue was about $2 million, but now there was no revenue because production had stopped, asking if $5,000 was really too much. Thursday, Richard returned to the company, but not as an employee, as a consultant. He requested a separate office for himself, set his own terms, established his own working hours. His first job was to negotiate with insurance companies again, but this time on behalf of his own company, Coleman Risk Management Services. Richard made an offer to insurance companies. He would handle Summit Industries' insurance matters and provide personal guarantee, but now through his company. This meant Summit Industries now had dependency on Richard's company for insurance matters. Richard could end the agreement if he wanted, and Summit would become uninsured again. 6 months later, Richard didn't renew his contract. Instead, he had found 3 big clients for himself, Summit's 3 biggest competitors. Richard designed better, more comprehensive, cheaper insurance packages for these competing companies than Summit had. He gave them competitive advantage. What did Summit Industries do? They tried to find a new risk manager, but no one had the expertise and network Richard had built in 22 years. The newly hired people were buying expensive, inefficient policies. 1 year later, Summit Industries' insurance costs increased 3-fold. At the same time, their coverage was lower. 2 years later, Trevor resigned. The board of directors accused him of failing in cost management. 3 years later, Richard Coleman's Coleman Risk Management Services Company was the largest risk management consultancy in the region. It had 15 employees and 50-plus clients. What was Summit Industries' situation? It was still in existence, but was now a third-tier company. They had lost their competitive edge due to insurance costs. Richard never pursued revenge. He simply served those who knew his value. Today, Richard sits in his luxury office meeting with new clients. His 25-year experience certificates hang on the wall. On his desk sits a nameplate reading, Richard Coleman, President and CEO, Coleman Risk Management Services. When his phone rang, he saw Trevor's number. He didn't answer. Trevor's voice was heard in the voicemail. "Richard, please call back. We need help again." Richard smiled, deleted the voicemail, and focused on his next appointment. Sometimes the greatest revenge is serving those who value what you're worth. What did this story make you think? Share in the comments. And if you're indispensable in your field, don't forget to share this video with your friends.